isn't taught about fire. And I had the privilege of serving in uniform as a firefighter and a paramedic. It shaped my young life. The Great Boston Fire and the Coconut Grove Fire are responsible for an enormous, if not all, of the safety features that have come to all of our lives globally, and have helped us forget how much people used to fear fires. You know, go back 100 years ago, and almost everyone was worried about their homes burning down. You know, giant tenement fires. That happened in Boston. It happened. You know, structure fires are not a fun place. But what you'll hear about is how these tragic events led engineers, inventors, the fire service, and the ongoing, continual commitment of the fire service and fire engineers to keep making things safer. So if you look around the room, we have exit signs, we have exit pathways, we have automatic doors, we have breakaway doors, we have non-locking fire exits, there are fire extinguishers. You have all these things that were really triggered by these two events. So we're honored to have Stephanie Shoro here. Please listen, grab a book. She's a great Boston-based writer, and we'll have time to talk and exchange ideas afterwards. But please welcome Stephanie.
Wow, thank you. I am so honored to be here. Thank you, Jim. Thank you. I see people in the audience who have been really helpful in all my research, and I'm so appreciative of them. And let me just say something about the Dover Historical Society. Historical societies are my lifeblood. I couldn't do what I do without the people who work to preserve history that other people may not recognize, but you recognize the value, and you keep it for researchers like me and other writers who want to delve into history as it was lived by people, not just what's official business, not what just the leaders did, but the way people live their lives. And that's kind of where I like to write and the kind of books I like to write. So I'm really grateful for everybody here. Are we okay on sound here? Very good. And if we could turn off some of the lights at the front so we could see these a little better. Yeah, that's good. Maybe if that's okay, if it's not too dark. It's a little spooky, but it's so anyway. So thank you. So tonight we're going to talk about these two books that I've written. And the one thing I want to stress is I'm returning to these subjects. I wrote about the Great Boston Fire in my first book, and I wrote about the Coconut Grove previous. But that's the thing about history, and that's the thing about writing, is you return to these topics over and over again, and you find new information. And the reason and I'll talk more about the Coconut Grove, why I went back to that, but the Great Boston Fire, we're going to start off with that, and then we'll go to the Coconut Grove. It's a lot of material to get through. If I'm rushing, just wave and say slow down, but I want to try to give you a benefit of these books. But just so you know, these are topics I've returned to, and they intrigue me. The Coconut Grove, this is the third time out on that chapter. So, my name is Stephanie Shoro, as you know. I'm a former reporter. I work for the Boston Herald. I work for the Associated Press. I've lived in Boston since about 1989. And I just love this area. I love writing about it. Here are my books here. And you can see I write about drinking, the mob, the combat zone, the good topics. Not all that Puritan stuff, you know. But this is what I find fascinating about being in this area. So we're going to talk about a fire almost 150 years old. And we got to enter what are some of the lessons for it. Now, if people need seats, if they want to, I know it's embarrassing, but you can come all the way to the front, and there's room over on this side. So if that's easy, don't worry about interrupting. Okay, so what are the lessons of these fires for today? Well, we're going to start with the Great Boston Fire. Okay, and the first question people ask, well, why did you get interested in this fire? And I'll be honest with it, the scale, the massive conflagration that took out the downtown. This is the downtown area after the fire, and you can kind of see it looks like a bomb went. It looked like an atomic bomb went off. And when I first started seeing these pictures, I thought, wow, I go to downtown Crossing all the time. I did not know that whole area was decimated. What's the story behind that? How did that happen? And so that's what really got me intrigued with that particular fire. So to lay the context of this, going up to November 8, 1872 was Boston itself. It had about 250,000 people. It was a busy port city, lots of commerce, lots of wholesale. A lot of wholesale enterprises were right and based in the downtown. This is, when I talk about the downtown, I mean the area about Washington Street, what we call downtown Crossing Day, Washington Street, Summer Street, in that area. So it was a neighborhood for a long time, and then it became a retail and business area. And that's very important to keep that in mind, because that changed the nature of the safety infrastructure that was needed to protect this area. But you can see that this was Franklin Street before the fire, and you can see these big, huge, beautiful buildings. And they didn't just put up warehouses, they didn't just put up sort of structures, they put up temples to commerce. They were beautiful buildings, made out of granite, topped with wooden mansard roofs, as this kind of homage to the forces of commerce. And that happened roughly starting a little bit before the Civil War, and then speeding up after the Civil War. The whole downtown area of Boston was really built out. It changed from a neighborhood to a business district. Now, at the time, in 1870, Boston's fire department was considered to be one of the best in the nation. And not just by Boston people, because we always, we're the best. Anyway, but seriously, the fire department was considered a very, very good department. One of the problems was that bred a sense of complacency among the population, because they said, our people can take care of it. Well, they could until they couldn't. This is kind of a looking at the Boston during this time. You'll see this area has now been all built out, so with landfill, but that was the structure of the city. And even though there was a good fire department, there were serious major flaws in the safety infrastructure of the city at that time. Aging water mains were the main thing. In this area of downtown, it had water mains under the street, which brought in water for the fire engines. It was built for a neighborhood, for one family, single family houses. But now the buildings there were up to 4, 5, 6, even 7 stories. That was huge. And there was a lot of concern that there wasn't enough water to get to the tops of those buildings to keep everybody safe. There was also a lack of fire stations in this very vulnerable area. And then there were those popular mansard roofs that I mentioned, which were really a nice embellishment, but they were considered a fire hazard. But they were so beautiful and people liked them that they continued to build them. There was also an alarm system that was based on locked alarm boxes, and I'll get back to that. Now, it's not that we look back and say, oh, what we know now, they didn't know then. That's not the case. They knew then. There were problems, mostly from the work of this gentleman, John S. Darrow, who, by the way, I might jump to the punchline. He retired to Dover, so he's really basically one of yours, and he's a great guy. Believe me, we all fall in love. When anyone who researches fire just falls in love with this guy, because he was just a real gentleman, and he was devoted to the fire service. He was an orphan, but he grew up. He was a builder, a carpenter. He knew how to build buildings. So when he was elected to the position of chief engineer, and that's what they called the chiefs at this time, chief's engineer, he knew how to keep buildings safe because he built them. He knew about them. And he knew there were real problems in the city, in that downtown area, about keeping the city safe. And he was devoted to his job, and he was determined to make the city safer. So he endlessly went to the city government to say, we need better water mains, we need a better system, we need more attention to firehouses in this area. So when I did my research, I looked through his annual reports, which are all online thanks to the Boston Fire Historical Society. You can look them yourself. And you can see he's asking for this, he's asking for this, he's asking for this. And he discovered the city officials just were kind of, well, yes, you advocate for your department, but please do not magnify the wants of your department so much. In other words, sit down and be quiet. And he persisted, but he was basically ignored for a large part. Now, at this time, let's put this in context. In the 19th century, fires were destroying many urban areas around the country. It was a real problem because a lot of these urban areas, the cities, had grown up too fast, and they were facing the same problems as was Boston. One of them was the fire in Chicago, which we've all heard about, right? Mrs. O'Leary's cow, late one night. Anyway, we all sang that at camp. At least I did. But this fire, devastating fire, almost 300 people killed, took out a huge swath of the city, burned a little bit more in the residential area, took out a huge area, and was news around the world. Daryl was very alarmed by this, and so after the Chicago fire, he went down to Chicago, he went up to Chicago, whatever, with money for the firefighters, but also to find out for himself what happened. And he came back convinced that what happened in Chicago could happen in Boston. And there's a great copy of his speech that he gave to the city council. He said, pay attention to this, we need to do something. What happened there could happen here. And what happened to him, of course, he was ignored. Because we lived in Boston was the Athens of America. It was not like that cow town. We didn't have cows that would kick off buckets. No way, we would be all right. So again, he was ignored. Now, one thing that I want to mention, this is a kind of a side note to this story, but I found it to be very interesting, but particularly given the pandemic that we just went through. But there was something associated with the 1872 fire. It's called an epizootic, and it was a pandemic for horses, for the beasts that really drove our economy at this time. Remember, this was before automobiles. There were trains, but there were not the gas-powered engines. So horses drew everything, hence the term horsepower. Okay? So what happened was horses, starting in about October of 1872, started to fall sick. And they didn't know what it was. Was it distemper? Was it a flu? And you can see here, like 25,000 horses sick in New York. And it started in Canada and spread through the entire country. Now, we don't know what caused. We still, to this day, we do not know what causes. It did not kill the horses, but it made them very sick. Made them very sick with the flu. And people couldn't really figure out how it was spread because a horse would seem fine, and then a few days later it would show symptoms, and then other horses would be fine, and a few days later they would show symptoms. And I think we've seen this before. We've lived through this before, but this was for horses. So this shows you a little bit how sick they were. Some of them did die, but it was a handicap the whole economy. This is how it spread, and this roughly follows the railroad, because what it was is that when they moved horses by rail, they spread the sickness. So it was spread from town to town. And there's a lot of people who've looked at this equine thing, and it's a fascinating story in how diseases spread. The horses eventually did recover, but in the meantime, you had people who had to serve as the beasts of burden from this. And it's interesting, another little sidelight of this is that out of this came a bit more of a movement to protect horses. Roger Angel Memorial, I don't know if you have pets, you've taken him there. His group was very much involved with trying to make sure these horses weren't worked to death. Now, there's one thing about horses and fire, which is that horses at this time drew or pulled the fire engines, the steam fire engines. In previous incarnations before they were steam, they were hand pumped They were lighter, and men pulled them. All the firemen would pull them, and they were all men at the time, by the way. And then as the machines developed, the steam engines developed, they grew heavier, and horses were required. And these were very specially trained horses. They would go to a fire, they wouldn't run away. They handled the smoke and the sparks. When the bell rang, they would go right up to their stall, and the harnesses would drop down, and they'd be off to a fire. So these horses were amazingly well trained, but in the month before the fire, they got sick. So the city's fire horses were decimated, and Damerel was worried about this. What are we going to do? And so he drew up all these plans, and men would pull the fire engines, and we would have fewer fire engines respond to each alarm so that we wouldn't leave anybody uncovered. So it looked like this plan was working. It was a very elaborate plan, but it didn't. It worked until it didn't, and that was when we get up to the fire. I can explain that a little bit more. So I'm often asked what caused the fire, and you're going to see this phrase, a systems failure, because it's important here and it's important in the Coconut Grove fire. What caused the fire is really not that important. Fires broke out all the time. There were a lot of fires in this area. They could come from a fireplace, they could come from a lantern, they come from a spark. The thing about this fire is that it spread so uncontrollably. So it isn't a matter of that it had a special cause. It could have been anything, but it was the system that caused it to become this huge fire. And I like using systems to explain issues. The National Fire Protection Association even has something called if you can't see, let me know. Okay. It's called the Fire and Life Safety Ecosystem, and it has all these aspects that go into firefighting and fire protection and basically keeping everybody safe. And it's a series of different things. And I think you can apply this model to the Great Boston Fire and say, look, it wasn't just one thing. It was a series of system failures. This is important because if we want to prevent a fire like this again or fires in the future, it's good to look at the system, the whole way of doing things. So we do know this, that the fire was first seen in this building at Kingston Summer Street about 7 p.m. Saturday, November 9th. Now, this is in the business district, so Saturday night, most people were gone, businesses were closing up. The speculation is that in the basement furnace of this building, a spark escaped and set some wood or set something on fire, and within a few minutes, this fire moved through the whole building. It was filled with goods. There were about 4 businesses here, filled with goods, cloth, leather, all kinds of material, including hoop skirts, and a lot of the buildings at this time were packed because the holidays were coming up. And so it just proved to be an inferno, and it very, very quickly got out of control. Now, there was an alarm. Box 52 was sounded. Here's the problem. Again, a system failure. There was an elaborate alarm system throughout the Boston area for alerting people where fires were. In fact, Boston, again, invented this system. I'm not kidding. We did it first. It was a fire telegraph system. It was a very elaborate way of turning a crank, alerting the fire alarm headquarters. The fire alarm headquarters would see the box, would say, okay, box 52, let's ring the bells that show where this fire is. 5 strikes, 2 strikes, 5 strikes, 2 strikes, 52. And that would direct all the fire company to that particular location. But these boxes were kept locked. The reason being is they worried about people turning in false alarms. So there was a delay in getting to this. Now police had keys, and so did people like responsible citizens in the area, but there was a delay. Notice they saw the flames about 7 o'clock, but the first alarm didn't go until 7:24, and the second alarm, third, fourth alarm brought everybody in the city. Now, you might say, well, that isn't that much time, but in a fire, especially a fire like this, that was the problem. The fire got out of control before the fire companies were able to arrive. And it spread. It just relentlessly spread. Summer Street, so it spread up Summer Street, that's the old Trinity Church, and it just kept going. Now, there were fire engines there very quickly, and even though they were pulled by the men and not pulled by horses, they were able to get there maybe 2 to 3 minutes in delay. That's about it. But you can see they had a problem here. One was, you're going to see the streams of water were not reaching up very high. And in some cases, the pressure was low, and in some cases, water would just trickle out altogether. And so they'd have to move back, reset, and try to get water up. You can also see huge numbers of people in the street. That was a problem too, because people came to watch fires. Businessmen tried to get their stuff out of there, and when they couldn't get it out, they'd just give it away. So there were people getting free stuff, there were looters. It was a massive, again, a system failure of trying to control the population there. I've got some more pictures here. Again, you can see the streams not going high enough. The fire was spreading roof to roof. One thing, we don't have any pictures of the fire itself. There are no pictures of the fire itself, but a lot of these illustrations were based on eyewitness testimony, so they're pretty accurate. Here's a picture of Franklin Street before the fire. Here it is during the fire. You can see how dramatic that is. And this picture, again, shows the fire starting, going from roof to roof, burning from the top down, which made it extremely difficult to fight. Fires spread in a really dramatic fashion. It created its own wind, so it was almost like this hurricane of fire that moved through the city. Those beautiful granite buildings, turns out granite has a lot of pockets of air inside, so it would heat up and it would explode. So there was exploding granite popping out all over the city. Brick did better, but the granite buildings, you'd think they did well, but they didn't go. They were not very fireproof. You can see that the fire burned right down to the water. If it wasn't for the ocean, it would have hit England. We're lucky with that. This is a wonderful map created by a man who did a documentary on the fire, Damerel's Fire, and he shows how it spread and the kind of relentlessness. And there's a lot of maps that show this, but he timed it to the arrival of different places. So you can see spread here, spread out here, took out the wharfs there and kept going. Now the firefighters were fighting it. In fact, they were dramatically firing it. This is a great illustration of that. But you just can't imagine how difficult it was. No safety equipment, no helmets, no breathing apparatus. All they had were the water and trying to get water on these flames. And it was a truly, truly remarkable feat of bravery for them to fight this fire. And they would, and often if the water ran out on them, which continued to do so, difficulty, you can imagine how they felt. One thing that I was able to do with the power of the internet, which you can complain about, but it's great for researchers, is that I was able to find a lot of stories about this fire. Turns out a lot of people at the time witnessed it, which I didn't know. Louise May Alcott went down and actually walked around and looked at the fire. William Lloyd Garrison was a spark. He liked fires. He liked going out to fires. There's a lot of stories about him dragging his son out in the middle of the night. But he went out and looked at the fire. Alexander Graham Bell, they all had 3 names. You notice that, Alexander? He went out and wrote an eyewitness account of it, sent to the Globe, and the Globe never printed it, so I couldn't find it. So it seems to be lost in history. But he was out there, so the whole city was out there. One thing Damerel did very smartly is early on he called for help from all over the area. So fire companies from Vermont, from Connecticut, Maine, New Hampshire, I'm not sure about Vermont now that I think about it, but came to this area. So not only did cities from all around the area, from Malden to Cambridge to Charlestown to, Peabody, farther and farther away. Everyone came to Boston to help with this fire. A lot of them pulling their fire engines, and some of them loaded up fire engines on trains and brought them down by train. And this is what this shows. So he was able to bring in people from all over the region to fight this fire, and that's one of the reasons that perhaps the fire, the Old South Meeting House, was almost burned, but the Kearsarge, which was a company from New Hampshire, came down from Portsmouth and was credited for saving it. Whether there's some ambiguity whether they did or not, but they certainly were there, and certainly people were able to. It's probably it right there was able to save the Old South Meeting House. In fact, the fire was finally put out by sort of a concentrated effort. Daryl was able to mass his people, excuse me, on one side there, with reinforcements from all over the area. Was finally able to put it out. The fire broke out again on Monday, but for all intents and purposes, by Monday morning it was out. Took out that area of Boston. You can kind of get the sense of it. Final tally was 776 buildings, about 60 acres, well over $1 billion. I mean, it was a huge amount of money. This fire is considered one of the most expensive per acre because of everything that was in that downtown area. Now, number of people killed, less than 30 people, because it wasn't here. So it was a low loss of life, very low loss of life, but there's a high loss of firefighters. And here's a list of them who lost their life. There's a little bit of ambiguity. They didn't keep very good records, so John Richardson, New Haven, we're not quite sure if he died. There's some ambiguity about that, but these are the people that died giving their lives. Now, after the fire, something interesting happened, and that was that photographers rushed into this area to get pictures. And if you want to see some of them, you can go to the Boston Public Library. And it was this amazing amount of things that they captured, including these eerie images of these buildings, kind of left, and they wanted to capture the sense of the devastation. Another interesting thing, as a media person, I'm interested in this, is that papers at that time could not reproduce photos, but what they would do is they'd get photos, and then their artists would recreate it. So you can see that's the photo, and that's the artist recreation of it. So that's why I'm saying the pictures in many of the papers were fairly accurate. They also did things like, created a panorama, which was a new thing, and this was Black's. He was a famous photographer at the time. He created this illustration. He took a picture, it was made into an illustration, but the original was very popular, and William Lloyd Garrison writes about getting it and how delighted he was to have this picture. I don't know where it is now, but he did get it. There was something else that was going on, which I thought was interesting, is that stereoscopic cards were very important. I don't know if you saw you used to have those, what do they call them? The stereo things you put the masters, what do they call? Viewmasters. Viewmasters. There you go. Thanks a lot. That's right. Viewmasters. Yeah, I should know that. But Viewmasters, those were very popular. And what happened was that this technology we developed, and so photographers flooded this area to get pictures that they could turn into stereoscopic images. And they made thousands of these things. In fact, afterwards, you can come up and look at them. I have some here, courtesy of eBay, where you can find everything but these pictures. And I even got a stereoscopic Viewmaster. That's from that area. And you can put it on, flip this down, put it on, and you can get a sense of this 3D technology. People love this stuff. They went crazy over it. And you can say, oh my God, why would they want to look at this horrible, tragic, devastating pictures? And I don't know, have you been to the movies lately? Everything gets blown up. Everything is blowing up here and there and there. And these were the disaster movies of their day. People like seeing, for whatever reason, people like seeing this. Another reason why I returned to this fire was that things come up. For example, I didn't know that people sold relics of the fire, but I gave a talk at the Bear Cove Fire Museum, and turns out they had a box of material that was reportedly saved from the fire, including these 2 letters, which I thought were fascinating. So I'd already written my book, but I was like, wow, this is very cool. So more stuff there. Now the thing about this fire is that Boston rebuilt fairly quickly. You can see here, people were very enterprising. They went to their old house and said, hey, if you want our goods and services, here's where we are now, come here. And in fact, one guy even said, oh, if you only manage to get 1 shoe we're giving away, come to us and we'll give you the matching shoe. I mean, there are a lot of entrepreneurial efforts there. A lot of times the safes survived the fire, and there was also what you would call disaster tourism. A lot of people came to view the ruins. So there was a lot of enterprise out of that. And in fact, there were testimonials about from a safe company that published something that said, look, our safe survived even the Great Boston Fire by our safe. And so Boston essentially rebuilt relatively quickly. They had an opportunity to straighten out the streets. They didn't really do that in this area, so the streets, similar, a few changes to what they were back then. But Boston excels at one thing, having commissions and studying stuff. So they had to have a commission to look into who caused this fire, what happened, and who's to blame, and who do you think they blamed? John M. Dammer got the bulk, even though he had warned about it, even though he'd said this could happen, he got a lot of the bulk of the blame for doing it because of some decisions he made, which were minor, and then his decision to be on the front lines and not standing back. So he got a lot of the finger pointing after the fire. And there's a lot more to this fire. I'm going over it a little quickly because I want to make sure we have time for the Coconut Grove. But a lot of that is in my book. So the aftermath of the fire, greater attention to issues of building and zoning. It took a while for Boston to kind of catch up to it, but they're able to do that. They did make improvements to the water system. They unfortunately had a number of fires before they really got serious about making sure that buildings were built safer, had more safety features built into them. And in this case, guess who helped them out? It was John Darrell. Darrell, he was reelected fire chief. But then in 1873, they reorganized the department, partly as a result of this fire. He had enough, and so he quit. Now, he could have just left. He could have just left this whole public service sector, but he didn't. He helped to found something that is going on today, which is the International Association of Fire Chiefs. He became the chief of the city department's building inspector. He became the first building inspector for the city of Boston. And he made a major push to get better codes there. He worked hard to establish the national model building code, which is something the NFPA, which I mentioned, uses. It's promulgated all over the country. He really pushed for that. His son became building commissioner. And so he I think died in 1902, I believe, but he stayed in this area. He could have licked his wounds, run off, but he decided to stay in there and continue to push for reforms. And he eventually, as I said, retired to Dover, and his helmets, I believe, are still at the Dover Fire Department. And a grandfather caught them. But he's an amazing man. He never gave up. He's not buried here. He's buried in Boston, in an area that's near the firefighters' lot in the Forest Hill Cemetery. And today, there's very little of what you can see about this fire, but Box 52, it's still called Box 52. It has this little lantern on the top. It says 52 on it. It's actually a different number, but it's kept up there. So the people going to Starbucks can see all of the history. And of course, the Old South Meeting House is still there, one of the few buildings that last through this time. The one thing that I can mention is that in the 19th century, the problem was cities burning down, and now we have the problem of what they call wildland fires, in which fire in wilderness areas is moving. Towns that are near wilderness area are burning down. We're having forest fires. So we have another sort of dilemma that firefighters need to face. So lots to tell about this fire, has a lot of impact. But let me go ahead and talk about the Coconut Grove fire. Let me see what my time is. Okay. And again, I wrote a little book on this. I wrote about it in my book, my first book, Boston on Fire. Then I did a separate little book on Coconut Grove. And you might say, well, why are you going back to it? Why do you keep returning to this? And it's a good question. Oh, by the way, you can't hear it that well. That's Jacques Renard's Coconut Grove Orchestra. Yeah. Okay. But the reason I went back to it was because of the stories. Because at events like this, people would come up to me and tell me stories about how they survived the fire, or how they're not them, but well, sometimes them, but their parents and their grandparents and the effect of the fire. And I realized that this event has had an impact over 3 generations. Not just the people who died in the fire, but their descendants or their relatives. Not just people who survived the fire, but their children and the people who fought it, and the nurses that treated the men and the doctor treated them. So it just was this ever expanding circle of impact. And I said, I want to go back into it. And by that time, I've also learned some things that made me question what I put in my own book. So I went back and rewrote it. So just a little review of this fire, for those who don't know about it. Most people here know, most everyone know what the Coconut Grove nightclub fire was in 1942? Does everyone? Okay, so this is approximately where it was in the area, what we call Bay Village now. So its footprint was about like that, roughly. It's a little bit rough in that particular area. Here's a better picture of it. You can see Piedmont Street, Charlotte Street, Church Street, Broadway. And it was kind of this complex of buildings here. So it wasn't just one big building, it was a complex of buildings. And I think that's important to understand how this fire spread. It was started in 1927 by 2 enterprising people. One was Mickey Alpert, who was kind of a band leader and kind of more of an entertainer, and Jacques Renard, who was a famed musician. They founded it. They modeled it after the Coconut Grove in Los Angeles. This is a nightclub. I've not found any postcards of the Coconut Grove in Boston, but lots of postcards of the one in Los Angeles, and that's what it was modeled after. Some early pictures of it from the outside, the inside. Had this distinctive, this is the front entrance, this is where the revolving door led people to the club. This is the main ballroom there, and it had the South Seas motif with these palm trees, and kind of just the whole aura of it was to be like a tropical island in the middle of sunny Boston, cold, in the middle of cold and miserable Boston in the wintertime. Not that it isn't great in the fall, but anyway. The 2 guys who owned it launched shenanigans in the way they got it open. I won't get into that. But the point is that they were hit by a couple things. One was prohibition. They could not legally sell booze in that club, and so that proved to be a real problem. So they ended up getting out of the business and selling it, or somehow it passed to a gentleman right here, who's King. His name was Charles Solomon. King Solomon, he was, let's see, how can I put this? Gangster. There you go. He was a total gangster, and he ended up running the club. But he was your old-fashioned gangster. He kind of looked at it as his fiefdom. He was there a lot. You can see how nattily he's dressed there. And these are some of the people we got with. Unfortunately, King Solomon went to another club after hours one evening. He was accosted by 4 men. They got into some kind of altercation. Shots rang out. The men fled. And King Solomon staggered out, shot in the stomach, saying, "The dirty rats, they got me." Or according to the Herald, which of course makes it right. But anyway, basically, he again a very colorful person who was associated with the Coconut Grove. Now, the club after 1933, first of all, Prohibition was gone, so the club could make a profit. It was taken over by a guy named Barnett Lansky, who was the lawyer for King Solomon. And Wolanski was more of a businessman. He was really someone who really pushed to make it a profitable establishment. He built it, it became a complex. He added this new area here, what they called the new lounge. People often refer to it as the Broadway lounge, but it was just the new lounge. They put in downstairs from here something called the Melody Lounge, which was more of a speakeasy atmosphere. But as you can see from this, it was a series of different rooms. It wasn't just, this is the main dining room. There's something called a caricature bar, he said it. But you can see it's a very lively, very big and complicated building. This area was not for patrons. This is for the staff to pass through. And so there was, when we look at it and look at how the fire spread, it's interesting to see that it spread through these different rooms. Just before the club opened up, just before the new lounge opened up, it was inspected and was found to be okay. Interesting fact. Now, let's talk about the night of November 28, 1942, because there were a lot of interesting things happened that day. One was a very important game between Boston College and Holy Cross, football game, and it was played in, who knows? There you go, Fenway Park, there you go. Big thing, a lot of people went to it, and the Eagles were expected to, the Boston College Eagles were expected to win. They did not, they lost 55-12. And this was a huge tragedy for people in Boston College people. Oh, they lost, and we were going to go to the Sugar Bowl. And it's interesting how tragedies can be viewed different ways the next day, but they were very, very upset about that. Now, that evening at the Coconut Grove, there were a lot of football fans there, and I'll talk about who was there, why they were there. But people, the thing I got to stress about the nightclub era was that everybody went to the nightclubs. It wasn't just for young people. It wasn't just for old people. Everybody went there. There were couples there celebrating their anniversaries. There were people on dates. There were whole families with children as young as 15, 16 who came in. So it was a place that everybody went to. And that Saturday night it was packed with people. And there was one celebrity, which was Buck Jones, who was a cowboy star. And he starred in almost 100, more than 100 films, 166, I think, films. And I was looking into his life because and he just had an amazing life. He was a real cowboy. He just got into that sort of market of churning out westerns. But he had his own way of doing westerns. And I looked at, you can see some of his movies on YouTube. They're not the greatest things, but they're fun to look. And he certainly was a very colorful character, and he was certainly very devoted to the idea of what a cowboy could mean. He had a group called the Buck Jones Rangers, which was his club of people. And when he was in Boston on a bond, he was promoting bonds, the buying of bonds to support the war effort. Remember, the World War II was going on at this time, 1942, and he's promoting his latest movies. So he was in the club that night. He wasn't going to go there. He was feeling sick, but a group of movie executives convinced him to go. In fact, there's a lot of, who was at the club that night is a matter of a lot of speculation. And I'm sure that someone here will tell me the story of an uncle or a grandfather or a grandmother who was going to go to the club that night, or who left early and somehow missed the tragedy. And I think that is a very important point in looking at this tragedy because it shows how people thought it could happen to me, it could happen to anyone at that time. But let's go into what happened that evening. There's a lot of things we don't know, a lot of things we do know. Around 10:15 in the downstairs Melanie Lounge, a busboy lit a match. Someone had pulled out a light bulb, and the busboy was told or offered to put in the light bulb, and he couldn't see where it went, so he lit a match and he put it in, and then fire was seen in the palm tree, and then was seen in the ceiling. There was a cloth that covered the ceiling of the Melody Lounge, and it started to catch there. The fire ward moved up the stairs from that lounge into the main dining area, and by about 8:15, the main dining area was engulfed, spread all the way into that new section, the Broadway Lounge, or what was the new lounge by 8:20, and the first victims came to Boston City Hospital at 10:35, and it's interesting, the fire was considered out by 10:45. Very quick movie. Let me show you this picture. This is a picture. This is actually in the Melody Lounge. This is the what was the palm tree. This is what's left of the palm tree. You notice a lot of things are still in the lounge, but that's the corner where they believe the fire started. There's a lot of mysterious things about this, but that happens to be a picture there. This illustration from NFP Journal shows kind of the trajectory. It came up through the club. And here's a picture of it on fire. And it was devastating. Basically, the fire it came through the building. Now, here's the interesting thing. You could see it moved through, but it did not achieve what they call flashover. It didn't get to the point where it burned everything. The Station nightclub fire in Rhode Island, as you know, that was a flashover. The building burned down. The fire moved through this building, but it did not burn everything in its way. It did burn like this area of the revolving doors, but you can see a lot of stuff is left in the club, and that's been considered. That's one of the mysteries of the club, why there were things left. This is roughly an illustration that basically people, like in a fire, wanted to get out. Most of them came from this area, tried to get out the revolving doors, right here. People came up from the Melody Lounge here to a door. There was a door here. It was supposed to be a safety door. They couldn't get it open. It was blocked. It just could not be opened. People tried to get out this revolving door. It's jammed, and people couldn't get out. There were other entrances, extras. This was blocked here. There's other blockages or difficulty getting out here. This was a very sad case in this new lounge area. Basically, the door, there was kind of two doors here. One opened inward with the flow of traffic. This one, instead of opening outward, opened inward. So what happened is people pushed up against this door, blocked it. People couldn't get out. It was stuck there. So people were stuck there. So you had a lot of people who just could not get out of the club. And I think, again, what causes fire, not as important as why people couldn't get out. And that is the real issue. That's the real lesson, is that, and that's what produced a lot of changes. The idea of exit here, exit there, lights, we can see it. Problems go on, you can't get out there, go out there. Maybe go out here, go out here. In other words, we saw this again in the Station nightclub. People tend to go out the way they've come in, and that can often pose problems. So if there's one lesson I can say that's been impressing me is be aware of the exits, and you may not go out the way you came in. It might be a difference. So, this was headline after the fire, and basically, so many people died. We're estimating, and the guy who really did a good job of this, 490 deaths. 490 deaths in this fire, including somebody who committed suicide, and some people who died later in the fire, died of their injuries later, not right away. So when people say died in the fire, you have to qualify that because a lot of people lingered for a while. There were hundreds of people injured, and a lot of people escaped. What's interesting about that is Casey Grant, who's with the National Fire Protection Association. We had a long talk about the fire, and he says, you know, usually in a fire there's a small amount of fatalities, there's a larger subgroup of injured, and then there's a huge subgroup of people who escaped. And that is not the case in the Coconut Grove. A huge number of people were caught and died in this fire. And these pictures give you a sense of that. Some people did get out. A lot of people were treated at Boston City Hospital, Mass General Hospital. There were many innovations in terms of treating burns and lung injuries. These are some of the photos from that. Give a sense of that. One thing my book does is I interviewed nurses. I try to include the story of nurses who treated some of these people. I think we tend to often look at the doctors, and that's important, but the nurses who gave the hands-on care to a lot of these people there, some of them were the reason that some of these people survived, was the nursing one-on-one care that was given. And many of those nurses suffered lifelong kind of psychological trauma from having to deal with these cases, because they were pretty horrific. So, 490 deaths. I'm saying 160 to 200. There's different figures about that. Some people didn't go to the hospital, but they were injured. One committed suicide because his wife died. He was so overwrought with that. In fact, there's been a lot of psychological studies from Coconut Grove victims. There was produced some of the first studies about survivor's guilt, or what we call post-traumatic shock, came out of looking at these people. Buck Jones died in the fire, and a number of children were left orphaned by this fire. Now, again, what caused it? We know the busboy lit a match, but a lot of people said, no, could just one match cause all these problems? Officially, it's of unknown origin. Officially unknown origin by the fire commissioner, and the state fire marshal absolved the busboy, a guy named Stanley Tomaszewski, from guilt, from culpability in that. Now, that's not prevented a lot of different theories about this. These were theories from the time of what really could have caused it, including up to sabotage by German agents. There's also, and I misspelled methyl, but methyl chloride theory is another theory that this was being used in a refrigerant unit. Some people believe this. This was the thing that ignited and sent a fireball through the club and then burned out. And certainly this fireball has some elements of methyl chloride, but methyl chloride is heavier than air, and they would not explain it coming up out of the bottom of coming up from the melody lounge and spreading through the club. So we still are working on that. Now, let me just tell you a couple more results, which were mentioned: burn and lung treatments, a lot of innovations there. Legal precedents. Someone was telling me that the new mayor of Boston, Mayor Wu, studied this fire in law school, and because it set so many legal precedents, or they're aware of it. And a guy named John Esposito wrote a book about the legal precedents that were set by this fire. The other thing is about safety rule enforcement, and that's the codings and rules about the number of places of assembly. After this, nightclubs, restaurants were considered places of assembly and therefore subject to exit codes and other things. Revolving doors, for example, you will not see a revolving door in Boston if you're without two swinging doors right beside it. But the one thing that I want to emphasize on this is that some of these things, like revolving doors, that the revolving doors could jam, this was known before the fire. Just like the Great Boston Fire, we knew this could be a problem. They knew it. But the public officials and private businesses lacked the political will or the economic incentive to do anything about it. So a lot of the problems in the Coconut Grove were things that we knew about. By we, I mean inspectors and other folks who deal with fire safety. They knew it was a problem, but it still wasn't corrected ahead of time. So that is a lesson here that sometimes we know what to do, but we fail to do it. We know what to do. We failed to do it. The Barney Wilansky was on trial with 2 other people. They were acquitted, including his brother was at the club at the time. He was found guilty. He went to jail, but was later pardoned by Governor Tobin at the time. And there's some sort of shenanigans about that, which I won't get into. But here's something I want to dwell on just really quickly. There's a lot of myths that I'm trying to correct about the fire. Was Boston College planning a victory party at the club that night? And only because that they lost this horrible game, tragically, they canceled their plans and they didn't go there. That may not be true. That may not be true at all. I mean, in fact, they did have a party, but it was at a different location that evening. So there's some mythology about it that, somehow God intervened to make sure that Boston College people were not in that fire, although at least one person from Boston College was in that fire, and a number of Holy Cross people. Now, I've never liked this theory because I can't see why God would favor Boston College over Holy Cross. It doesn't make sense, but I do think there's some point to the story, which is when we have horrible tragedies, we seek meaning. We want to understand. We want to think, how could this horrible thing happen? So we seek for meaning on it. There's this idea that the city passed a law or regulation that no Boston club could be ever called the Coconut Grove. We don't find evidence of that. There's an understanding, as I'm told, understanding that this should not happen, and hopefully it never will, but it's not particularly specific. I talked about the 490 things. Buck Jones running back. There was, in fact, you'll find this online, that Buck Jones was a hero because he ran back to help people, and he died trying to help people. That's simply not true, but it gave comfort to his widow, who believed it to her dying day. And again, the fact that researching his life made me think, for him to die in a nightclub, given he was a man of the West, he was a man outdoors, he loved the ocean, for him to die in a nightclub fire, he would never go to. It's not a big. For him to die in this way, people wanted to give meaning to his life, unfortunately. And then I talked about what really caused the fire. And I'm just going to give you one slide on that, because Casey Grant and I talked about this. This is very interesting. Casey Grant is a fire engineer researcher, very good at that. And he's been working with students who are trying to explain not just what caused the fire, again, a lot of things caused it, but why it spread so quickly. And one thing he noticed is that the fire came up from the Holy Land, and he noticed this curve here of this ceiling. And there's some speculation that maybe the fire came through this, and the configuration of the club sent the fire, projected it, kind of like water, and focused it. We don't know. We'll probably never know. But this is one interesting theory that I thought is really obvious with this photo that I kind of annotated here. But you can see here's where the revolving door was. There's where the melting lounge. This is looking toward Church Street. Check rooms here. Different things. Let me go quickly over one of the most important things. Is that history is never set. Things continue to develop. And this is another reason why I wanted to return this fire. We know that there was there's been a plaque that's been in the sidewalk by what was the site of the Coconut Grove for many years. And a lot of us wondered, is this enough? Is this enough for us to remember this fire, to remember the victims and its impact? And so a few years ago, Shawmut Street Extension was changed to Coconut Grove Lane in a big ceremony. So you had that kind of marker on site there. More information's come open. The Boston Police Department transcripts have been released, their interviews, and those interviews are very different from some of the other material. So you can compare and contrast those. It's all online and it's searchable, which is very, very important. There's been a really good documentary on the fire, 6 Locked Doors, which came out, and it goes on PBS every now and then. But again, it has some of the last interviews with survivors of the fire. Some really great interviews with people whose stories would be lost, except these filmmakers captured on film. So we have that as a legacy. Now the site itself is now luxury condos. That's where the Coconut Grove was, luxury condos. It's funny, I was over there some months ago, and they're having trouble. Apparently the sprinkler system kept going on. Kept trying to put water down on it. I thought, that's peculiar. So it's funny. So there's an effort now is nearby in Statler Park, which is some distance from the Coconut Grove, is to create a suitable memorial for it that would sort of be I think we're looking at it as a teaching moment, a way to honor the victims, but to not necessarily just look to the past, but look to the future and say, look, a lot of good came out of this fire, but a lot of bad. But it's a monument that if we know what to do, let's do it. Daryl knew what to do, but he wasn't let to do it. We knew what to do with the Coconut, but we couldn't do it. So I'm hoping that this memorial, which we're working on getting it, some people in this room are really working very hard on it. I don't want to take any credit from them. They're working on to get that up there. But the idea is that it will help to serve as a focal point for political will to do what's right, to protect ourselves, even if it's politically difficult, even if it's expensive, even if it's inconvenient, that we can do it to keep ourselves safe. And I'd like to conclude on that note. Thank you for your time and attention here. Let's put the lights up, and I want to answer any questions that you might have. 5 minutes. Hi. Yes, sir. Can I help you?
Are you planning to do a study of the station nightclub?
No, it's been written about a number of times, so I probably will. I've written on these 2 fires. I think I'm going to leave fires go for a while, but there are some books out on the station. It's a very interesting story. But I won't be doing it, but someone else can take it on again. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, in fact.
Yeah, in the Great Boston Fire, did they try blowing up buildings to create fire breaks?
Yes. Yeah, the question was, did they try to blow buildings? Yes, they did. And that's a whole interesting aspect of the fire, because indeed there was the effort to use dynamite gunpowder. All they did not have dynamite, they had gunpowder. And there was an effort to blow up buildings to create blocks. Now, at first, Daryl was under great pressure to do a lot of this blowing up. Okay, he was reluctant. He didn't think it really did that much good, but he kind of gave in to citizens who wanted to go out and blow buildings, and so he gave a lot of power to citizens, and they were busy blowing up buildings all over the city. A couple things though. One was the fire might tend to jump, and the other thing was the gas mains. Every building had gas mains. Gas mains could not be turned off block by block. They could only be turned off by a main source. So you blow up the building, the gas flows out, it ignites, and suddenly, boom, you have another fire there. So it was determined to be probably not that effective. There's still some countries over it, but determined to not be that effective in terms of that. But that was a situation where Daryl gave in to blow up buildings. He was also sued by people who lost their buildings for many years, trying to get their money back. So thank you for that question. That's very good. Let's see, I think there was a hand here and then over there. So yes, ma'am.
Quick one, what was it about the mansard roofs that were so problematic?
The mansard roofs were made out of wood. That was the main problem. They were made out of wood. Some of them could be made out of metal or other, but they were not waterproof, they were not flame proof. So they're wooden. I think General called them elevated lumber yards because there was just so much wood on top that they couldn't reach. So that was the main problem with it. I think there were some things about the air, the way it was built, the trapped air inside would not make it. But the main thing, I believe, was the use of woods. Over there, yes.
I found it very interesting how little affected the inside of the building was by the fire. So what was the main cause of death? Obviously some people were burnt, but many, was it smoke?
In the Coconut Grove fire?
Yes, yes.
Okay, the main cause of death, it was interesting. There was a huge number of death, problems with that. A number of people were burned to death. But a number of people suffered severe lung injuries, very severe, because they were breathing in It was thought to be some sort of toxic chemical, but it was really just the combustion or half combustion of the material in the club, and they breathed that in, and they got very severe lung injuries. Some people had what they had carbon monoxide poison because they come in and their faces were cherry red, and that's a sign of carbon monoxide poisoning. Some people were deadly pale. Some people actually suffocated from a lack of oxygen because the fire sucked up all the oxygen and they suffocated. There were some people who got out of the club, would take a few steps in the cold air, it was very cold time, and just collapsed because when the cold air hit their lungs, it produced a lot of problems. So it was it wasn't just all burns. It was a series of things. One thing you did not have a lot of were broken bones. There was some feeling, people were trampling over each other to get out. They did not find evidence of that. That people just couldn't get out. They were stuck in there. So in the trial, the defense tried to say people caused their own death, and that was quickly disputed. But it was interesting that there were a range of symptoms that the victims presented, and it was a trial by fire, that's kind of redundant, but it was a real trial for physicians at Boston City Hospital and MGH to treat all these different things. There were a few people who were horrendously burned. There was a guy named Clifford Johnson who was burned over a huge proportion I forget exactly, a huge proportion of his body. He was not expected to survive, but he did survive. He met kind of tragic end later, but he did survive. Yes, sir.
There's an old expression, they don't build them like they used to,
Yes.
because there are laws against it.
That's true. But yeah, that was one of the things I think we have now is we have better, one thing they do in Boston, I think they really keep an eye on the crowd capacity because the Coconut Grove was overcrowded. The club was licensed for about 500 people, roughly. There were about 1,000 people in that club that night. It was just overcrowded. And people were just cheek to jowl in the dining room, downstairs, and in the Broadway lounge. I don't think that was so crowded, but the main dining room was extremely crowded. Yes, ma'am.
Where do you get the majority of your data for these older fires?
Well, a variety of sources. I mean, one of the things is that there's newspaper clippings, this kind of thing, official records, the police records that were recently released. There was something called the Riley Commission. Commissioner William Riley of the Fire Commissioner held a series of hearings. 200 witnesses, huge amount of witnesses. The problem with that, of course, is it's very contradictory. So one of the things you have to do as a researcher is weigh between these reports of what people say, because a lot of them contradict each other. What goes on with that? So there are some fire. A lot of the records from the Boston Fire Department were destroyed or lost, oddly enough. And here's an interesting thing. One of the investigators of the fire was a guy named Philip Dean, who was a state police detective. And he helped to investigate the fire because it was investigated by the fire, the police, by different agencies. He was one of the people who investigated it. He got death threats. And his son, Jack Deedy, who I interviewed a number of times, remembers going to school under armed guard because of the threats against him and his father. His father, after the whole thing was over, had a box of material that he kept, and then he burned it, or he threw it all away, because he was afraid of the impact. So a lot of the records of this fire have actually disappeared, and people were worried about it. A lot of witnesses hesitated to talk. It was so horrible, people couldn't talk about it. So it took years for a lot of people to come out with things. Paul Benzequin did a great book on the fire back in 1950 sometime. And he interviewed a lot of people. And again, I interviewed him, and he's, again, memory is distorted. If something's so horrible, you tell the story the way you remember it, and it's the way you wanted it to happen. So the thing about this fire is there is now a huge and growing amount of material out there. I believe that more books should and could come out on this fire. I do not think that my book the new book is at all any kind of end note. I think it definitely is something that, especially when you consider all the people affected, all their stories, there's definitely room for other books and other material. Any other questions?
What are you working on now?
What am I working on now? Okay. Funny you should ask. Actually, I'm working on a sweet project now. I'm working on a project it's an examination of a diary that was kept in 1891 by 4 women who went to Great Brewster Island in the Boston Harbor, and they created this diary with photographs and descriptions. It was like the Facebook page of 1891 is what it was. But this journal, it was discovered by accident by someone at Harvard, and we found it. We just said, this is a great document. So we're busy. We've transcribed it. We're republishing this journal. It's totally different from anything I've done. It's looking at the lives of these 4 women who went out to Great Brewster Island. So it's a real look at how women lived their lives in that time, and it's again kind of a different era, but to me it's fascinating, and nobody dies in it, so thank God, no deaths, no trauma. So that's the next thing. And then I also have a novel that is at a publisher right now, and hopefully, and it's a totally different. It's called Cat Dreaming, a novel of the 1980s. So it's sort of autobiographical. So that's what's next for me. And then and I'm going to be if you want to hear me actually read from the Great Boston Fire book, I will be at the Boston Book Festival, which if you're interested in books, I recommend that totally, not just to go to my session, but it's wonderful. It's all free. It's all about books. And lots of people will come, and it's an amazing event. I'm going to be reading about somewhere between 12:15 and 1:30 at the Boston Public Library on Saturday, October 29th. So if you want to hear me, I will not be lecturing. I'll be actually reading from the book. Plus, I'll be joined by other local nonfiction authors. So it could be fun. Could be fun, and it's free. Even better, it's free. So anyway, I really thank you for your time. I books for sale here. They're a deal, $20.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
You're always welcome to come back.
Oh,
We'd love to have you back for the
I
next.
appreciate that.
Sure.
Thank
Thank you,
you, guys.
everyone.
Yeah.
This has been terrific. I'd like to point out Michael Hanlon, who's sitting here in the second row. Michael's leading the charge and has welcomed me into the Coconut Grove Memorial effort. This man is unbelievable, his dedication to getting this done.
Yay.
And the amount of work that's gone on. So this is a wonderful piece. Along that line, I'm going to introduce my mother, who's sitting right behind him in the red jacket with her hand up. And she's holding a picture of Charles Capone Jr., who is my great uncle, her godfather and uncle, who passed in the fire. He and his cousin were at the Grove celebrating another friend who worked for them, who was going off to fight World War II, and the 3 of them all passed. So, this is something that's near and dear.
And that's in the book too.
Right.
Yeah, in the book. Yeah, another story. And
so
then go ahead.
We're this is near and dear to all of us. It's an important thing to talk about, and we so much appreciate Michael's efforts.
Right. And I just read of David Blaney, who's been doing research on this fire for years and years, was so generous with his time and effort. You were asking me where I get my information. It's right here. Because he's just done, they're amazing. There's just so much that you have to dig and dig and dig. So he's done an amazing job, and is gathering material that I think will be important for years to come. And I want to be the first to try to get him to do a Kickstarter campaign so we can publish his material too. So just look out for that.
And I want to compliment David even further. We have other members of the Historical Society who always sort of knew that they had some family connection. Mm-hmm. We gave some simple names, and within like 2 days, David gave, here's what happened, here's who they were with, how they died, where they were buried. So you're an unbelievable ambassador. Thank you. Thank you all. $20, actually, you're not allowed to take your car if you don't buy a book. You should take the opportunity to get a signed copy, that's great, they're collectible then.
If you want.
There's some refreshments outside if you'd like.
And you can
that.
come up and look at these things if you want to play around with these things here. Those there.
So thank you all very, very much. Remember December 2nd at the Legion, and we'll have a bar.